Hey everybody, and welcome to this, my third of 3 videos on the Nikon D1. In this video, we're going to cover the menu system, exclusively the menu system. Everything we're going to do is on the back of the camera. You need to turn it on, and then we're going to access the custom functions and talk about all 32 of the custom functions. So let's get in there and we'll scroll. What you want to do is once you're in the system, you use the rear command dial to scroll between them and the front command dial to change your settings. Okay? So the 32 settings are numbered 0 through 31. Everything is defaults to 0 unless except for the ones that don't, and I'll tell you those when I discuss them. Item 0 is A or B. Oops, I already did it wrong. And so when you're using the custom functions menu, you have to hold the CSM function down the whole time. So A or B, these are 2 different sets. So you can have 2 different sets of custom functions saved in your camera. So custom function 1 is image status. It has 3 options, 0, 1, and 2. 0 is that your photo is not displayed after capture. 1 is called capture preview mode. Your image is displayed before saving, and you have to tell the camera to save the image or it won't. 2 is standard instant review, where it will save the image and then display it. It's called record and review in this camera. Personally, I like 0 because it's going to save the image, and the battery life on these cameras is so weak that I don't want to eat it up with any unnecessary screen time. 2 is your EV stops. Default is 3, and your options are 3, 2, and 1. 3 is third stops, 2 is half stops, and 1 is full stops. With this camera, because it is old, and even taking raw files, it's going to you can recover a lot of data from raw files, but not as much as with modern cameras. You want to set this up to be as successful as possible, so third stop increments will give you, the best exposure you can get. 3 is your bracketing order, and the options are 1 and 0. So if you're in 0, this is called auto bracketing. The details of this are more in depth than I really have the ability to get into in this video. So with this one, there are different parameters that result in different bracketing orders. So what you want to do is check the manual, pages 53 to 55, for the tables that explain how this works if you're interested in it. Otherwise, if you set it to 1, it will do underexposed, properly exposed, overexposed, which is the standard and probably easiest way to use this. 4 is your autofocus activation. And what this means is that when there are 2 options, 0 and 1. Okay? 0 is that when the shutter is depressed halfway, your autofocus will turn on. 1 means that when you're using the autofocus on button on the back here, that's when your autofocus is turned on. So matter of personal preference which way you prefer to focus, with the shutter button or with AF on. I'm a shutter button guy, but whichever way works best for you is the one that you should use. 5 is anti-vibration mode, meaning a delay between mirror action and shutter release. And I'll tell you what, when I first got this camera, this was on, and it drove me nuts thinking that this camera was just a mess. So 0 is no delay and 1 is a delay. This means that when you push the shutter button, the mirror will flip up and you will take a picture. 1 means that when you push the shutter button, the mirror will flip up, there will be a delay, and then it will take a picture, which is annoying. 1 is good if you're going to be using a tripod or doing some microscopy or star trails or landscapes, whatever. That's a perfectly good use for that. You could also use a remote control at that point. 6 is your focus area selection. Basically, if you think back to old video games, this is the difference between the world wrapping and the world not wrapping. So with 1, if you have your focus areas here, right? With 1, you can keep hitting right and it will keep cycling right, going to the right over and over again. With 0, you can hit right and then it's going to stop when it reaches the far right one, and you can keep hitting right until the end of time and it will not move off of that far right focus point. Matter of personal preference, I like the world wrapping more than world boundaries. 7 is your auto exposure lock, and your 2 options are 0 and 1. 0 is your auto exposure locks only when the AEL AFL button is pressed, and that's this guy right up here. So with 0, the only way to lock your AEL, your auto exposure, is with this button. With 1, your auto exposure locks when the shutter button is half depressed. So if you want your exposure to lock when your autofocus kicks in, this is the way to do it. I prefer this because with 1, there is the possibility that your auto exposure will lock when your focus starts to activate, and that when the picture is actually taken, the lighting will be different, especially with a moving object if they move into sun or into the shade, so it can throw off your exposure. Generally, if I'm going to be using AEL, it's intentional, and so I want to be able to control it, but that's just me. This is a matter of personal preference and shooting style, which one you want to go with. 8 is mirror up. Basically, this is 0 is your mirror is down during sensor cleaning, and won't let me select 1, which is supposed to be your mirror up during cleaning. So I'm not quite sure how this works or why that's not letting me choose anything but 0. 9 is your dynamic autofocus in single-servo autofocus, and it activates or deactivates closest subject priority is what this does. So 0 is your camera will focus on the closest subject. 1 is your camera will not necessarily focus on the closest subject, but will focus on the one that it can get the best focus on. Largely personal preference here. I tend to prefer 0 because I typically don't have foregrounds. So usually when I'm focusing, it's on the closest subject. But that said, if you do have foregrounds, 1 is a better option. It's just a matter of shooting style and personal preference, really, which one you want to use for this. 10 is dynamic AF in continuous servo mode. Basically, this is the exact same thing as 9, only with continuous servo instead of with single servo. 11 is auto exposure and flash exposure bracketing. So your choices are 1 through 4. So, well, that's 50, I guess that's 5B, AS, AE, and SB. So your choices are AS, AE, and SB. I was reading the numbers on my outline, not the titles. Anyway, okay. So what this does, when you bracket with a Nikon flash, bracketing can be done with either the flash, the camera's exposure, or both. So AS is the default. And with this, the flash and exposure control can be used to bracket flash photos together, meaning that when you bracket a flash photo, the camera can do that by adjusting the shutter speed, the aperture, or the flash brightness. With AE, only the flash's brightness can be used to bracket auto-bracketed exposures with the flash. And with with AE, only the camera exposure settings, the aperture and shutter speed can be used. With SB, only the flash can be used. So this is a matter of personal preference. With SB, this is my preference because it allows me to have better control over the camera's exposure settings, and the flash to me is less important. I'm more interested in controlling shutter speed and aperture than I am with the amount of light leaving the flash to get a proper exposure. So I don't want the camera overriding my settings when I use a flash to get a proper exposure. I want to know what's going to be in focus, for instance, especially with depth of field. But this is just a matter of personal preference and shooting style. They have different advantages. If you wanted to use both, that's just fine. And if you wanted to use only the camera's settings, this is really useful if you have a manual only flash, for instance. Although this only applies to Nikon flashes, so I don't know if that really applies after all. But if you wanted to do manual flash control on your Nikon flash, this would work well to have the camera compensate for errors in manual flash control using the exposure settings in the camera. 12. Command dial functions. These are 0 and 1. 0 is that the front command dial controls shutter speed and rear controls aperture. 1 is reversed. So that's just a matter of personal preference. Which one of these, which way are you comfortable using the command dials? That's that one. 13 is exposure compensation settings. Your choices are 0 and 1. 0 is exposure value compensation is done with the plus/minus button, which is that one on the top that I showed you in the second video, and the front command wheel. In 1, with 1, this only applies to PA and S modes. For A and S, the unused dial allows exposure value with 1, in A and S mode, the unused dial, front or back, depending on which mode you're in, allows EV compensation. In program mode, the main command dial, which is the one on the front, allows EV compensation. The benefit in this mode is that you can EV compensate on the fly without holding down the EV compensation button. So, matter of personal preference, I don't want to accidentally exposure value compensate, so I want to be deliberate in it, so that's why I keep it set to 0. 14. So this one has as its options 6, 8, 10, 13, and A, with 8 as the default. And this is your center-weighted metering area size. So when in center-weighted metering, is the central circle for that center-weighted area 6 millimeters, 8, 10, 13, or do you just have an old-timey averaging meter where the whole scene is put together to get an average reading? This is completely a matter of personal preference, how you want to use it. 10 is very close to the standard center-weighted circle setting. With APS-C, 8 might be the most spot on, but that's a little bit small for me. I tend to find that using a slightly larger center-weighted circle gives better exposures because it's less like spot metering. At 6 millimeters, you might as well just be spot metering realistically. But whatever you want to set this on, it's personal preference. 15 is meter turnoff, and your options are 4, 6, 8, and 16, and those are just how many seconds your meter will stay on before it automatically turns off. I like 16, just matter of personal preference and battery preservation, which setting you want to go with. 16 is the self-timer duration, and this is again just the number of seconds, which is 2, 5, 10, and 20. I happen to like 10. It's the standard over many years, so it's what I'm used to. But again, matter of personal preference on this one. 17 is LCD illumination. 0, my preference, I'll explain why in a minute, is when you when you turn the on or off dial to get the illumination turned on. 1, anytime you press a button, the LCD screen will light up. So I prefer 0 because battery preservation, but also because if this blue light turns on every time I push a button, that's going to be really annoying. 18 is LCD monitor auto power off, and you have 4 choices: 0, 1, 2, 3, and 0, 1, 2, and 3. 0 is 20 seconds, 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. So this is a matter of personal preference. Typically, I like 10 minutes or longer, but because of how short the battery life is in this camera, I keep it at 1. And that's only the LCD monitor, which is the big monitor up here, by the way. That's not for the camera itself turning off. 19 is aperture settings. Now, this one is a bit complex and applies to only variable aperture zoom lenses and some macro lenses. The difference here is that if the act of zooming or increasing magnification has no effect on aperture, or if those acts cause the camera to adjust the aperture. So I don't have it on me, but I have a 55mm f3.5 Nikkor macro lens. At infinity focus, it's f3.5. At closest focus, it's f5.6. Some zoom lenses also, it'll say something like f4 through f5.6, meaning that at its shortest aperture, shortest focal length, it's an f4 lens. At its longest focal length, it's an f5.6. This is the setting. This setting applies to those two situations. With 0, the aperture does not change. So if you zoom a zoom lens or a macro lens and you have it set to f8, it will stay at f8 no matter how you focus it or how you zoom it across the zoom range. 1 means that the aperture will change as you increase the magnification on a macro lens or zoom across the zoom range of a zoom lens. So let's say that you have a zoom lens that's f3.5 to f5.6 and that you have the aperture set to f11. So that's 2 stops beyond wide open if you are at the far end of the zoom range. Let's assume that you are. So if you zoom to the short end of the zoom range, 2 stops beyond wide open would be f7.1. So what that means is that if you, let's say you have an 18 to 55. At 55, you're at f5.6 for your wide open, and at 18, you're at f3.5. If you're set to 55 millimeters and you're at f11, and then you zoom back to 18 millimeters, the aperture will change to f7.1. So it will stay an equal number of stops beyond wide open. It won't stay at a fixed value with this setting. In my mind, this setting, having it set to 1 would be ideal for video. But this camera can't do video. So I'm sure there are times in which that would be useful. However, just a matter of personal preference, I tend to like a consistent aperture. I want to know what the aperture setting is going to be across the range, whether it's with a macro lens or with a zoom. 20, self-timer lamp when shutter releases. The options are 1 and 0. With 0, the lamp does not illuminate before exposure, and with 1, the lamp always illuminates before exposure, needed or not. Personal preference, I like to have it show up so that I know when the exposure is about to occur. 21, AEL, AFL button, and that's this guy right up here. So there are 4 options here, 0, 1, 2, and 3. 0 locks auto exposure and autofocus when the AEL and AFL button are pressed. 1, when you press that button, only exposure locks. 2, only focus locks. And 3, both lock, but it's a toggle. Personal preference on this one, how you want to shoot. I don't really use the AEL and AFL button often, so 0 works just fine for me. If you use it often, then one of the other settings may work well for you. 22 is aperture selection, 0 and 1. With 0, aperture selection is done with the rear command dial only. With 1, the aperture ring on the lens can be used. So if you have old lenses that don't have electronic contacts, you want to use 1. If you have lenses with electronic contacts, but you also use the aperture ring to control aperture, you want to use 1. 0 is going to be if all of your lenses have electronic contacts and you don't want to use the aperture ring at all. 23, sharpening. Options are 0 through 3, which are normal, normal, low, high, and none. So I keep this is kind of personal preference. I'm going to strongly recommend leaving it at 3 for none. The reason is that this has a 20-year-old computer. If you want to sharpen the images, sharpen them in post on your new computer with whatever software you buy or download for free on the internet today, because it is better than what's in this computer, I guarantee it. And there's not a knock against this computer. For the time, it was super advanced. But your current modern computer can do a better job, so just do it that way. So none is going to be your best choice because it will reduce the number of digital artifacts you get on your images through camera sharpening. 24, tone compensation. This is disabled if you shoot RAW. So I shoot RAW exclusively on this camera, so it's disabled. It does not matter what my setting is. 0 is auto, normal, low contrast, high contrast. And CS is a user-defined custom curve. So on auto, the camera produces optimal contrast. This is with matrix metering only, by the way. With other metering modes, this works exactly like option number 1. But if you have matrix metering activated, then the camera will pick the best contrast curve for your images. With 1, this is suitable for normal scenes with good tonal distribution. 2 is good for low contrast scenes like fog, and it helps prevent bright scenes from being washed out. 3 is high contrast, which helps bring out, 2 is for is called low contrast, but it's for high contrast scenes like snow or things like that, or where you have deep shadows and bright whites, and you don't want the highlights to be washed out and the shadows to have no detail. 3 is called high contrast, and it's good for low contrast scenes like fog, where you have hazy background details or UV scattering at great distances. And then the custom defined curve. And since I don't use this, I don't even honestly know how to do the custom defined curve. So it's in the manual though. 25 is continuous mode shooting speed. The options are CH, 3, 2, and 1, and CL. So with CH, the default is approximately 4.5 frames per second, which I didn't realize this camera was that fast. I thought it was much slower than that. 3 frames per second, 2 frames per second, 1 frame per second, and then CL. Each photo is written to the CF card before taking the next shot, and the camera does not use the internal buffer. So this would probably be really good for me if I was trying to not have the buffer underrun mess up my photos. But I have it set to CH, which is 4.5 frames per second, though, like I said, I don't use continuous shooting that often in this camera. This is just a matter of personal preference and also how good a CF card you have. If you have a slow CF card, you'll want to use a lower setting than CH. 26 is maximum shots in buffer for continuous shooting. The options are 21 and 1 through 20, are 1 and 2, 21 and 1, basically. Oh, here we go, 21 and 1 through 20. So with 21, this will allow you to have 21 JPEG photos in your buffer. If you're shooting RAW, you get 10. If you select a specific number, your buffer will stop at that number. If you shoot RAW, it only goes up to 10, and everything beyond that doesn't matter. So realistically, there's no reason to have a lower buffer on this unless you're using like a 16 megabyte CF card that only holds 5 images. But if you get a 1 or a 2 gig CF card that works in here, you're going to have more image storage than your buffer, so you just want to leave this at 21 in all probability. 27, LCD monitor display mode. This is basically what the monitor shows during image playback. Your options are 0, 1, 2, and 3. With 0, it shows only the image. With 1, it shows the histogram. With 2, the highlights. And with 3, it shows all 3 of those. It's just a matter of how much data you want when you see the image played back. 28 is save raw files. This option must be set to 1 if you want to save raw files. So 1 is you can save raw files. 0 is raw files are not saved, only JPEGs. 29, auto filing numbering. Auto file numbering, that's better. 0 and 1. Normal is 0, which is the number resets with a new CF card. And 1 is sequential file numbering between CF cards. I prefer 1 because if you fill up 1 or 2 or 5 CF cards in a shoot and you try to put them all on your computer, you risk overwriting files. It's just easier not to have to do that when you transfer from multiple CF cards. 30 is shooting in PC mode, which is when you're connected to a computer. S is single frame, C is continuous, and realistically, this doesn't matter. Okay, this is, in my notes it says, this is a 1394 Firewire cable. This camera cannot communicate with computers using Windows versions newer than XP. And frankly, if you're using XP, you've already been hacked and infected with a gazillion viruses, and you can't even watch this video because your computer is too old to watch it. So let's make fun of XP users some more because they're never going to know that we're doing it. Anyway, this is an obsolete function, and it doesn't matter what you set it to because your camera is not going to communicate with your computer. You can't tether to it anymore. 31, sensitivity up. Your options are 0, 1, and 2. 0 allows only the standard sensitivities of 200, 400, 800, and 1600. 1 allows access to high 1, which is 3200 ISO. 2 allows access to high 2, which is 6400 ISO. Now realistically, this camera should not be pushed beyond 400. There is simply way too much noise beyond 400 ISO for the images to be usable for anything. So just leave this at 0 because, as you can see, there is so much noise in the 64 and anything beyond 400 realistically that they're just not usable. So just keep that at 0. All right, and that is it. We have gone through everything there is to know about how to use the Nikon D1, the very venerable great-great-great-great-grandfather of every DSLR out there. This is one of those few shooting experiences with this camera that just remains good today. Very many DSLRs from the first decade of the 20th century they're not enjoyable to use. And this one really transcends that and remains an enjoyment to use today. Thank you for watching this video. Please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know that I'm on the right track producing content which is useful and helpful to you. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those in the comments section below. I'm pretty good about checking these every couple of days and answering questions. If you have any suggestions or ideas for future videos, and if I have the technical know-how and equipment, I'm more than happy to make those. One last thing. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. I gotta get up, Steinbeck. I have to turn off the camera.